Welcome to this deep dive.
Okay.
And today we're going to be exploring plant intelligence.
Interesting.
It's something that might completely change how you see the world around you.
I can see that
Yeah.
for sure.
We're going to be looking at a fascinating chapter from a book that really dives into both the hard science
Okay.
and the big. So what's questions that this all raises?
Right.
It's a lot to consider.
It is.
So buckle up.
Mm-hmm.
You might be surprised by what we discover.
Yeah, it's a field that really pushes us to reconsider our assumptions about life and intelligence even.
Exactly. And our guide in this chapter is Tony Truavas.
Okay.
He is a plant biologist who has dedicated over 6 decades,
Wow.
yeah,
6 decades.
to understanding these incredible organisms.
That's quite a career.
Yeah. And the chapter paints this picture of him at his 1800s farmhouse outside Edinburgh.
Wow. Okay.
And he's surrounded by these flourishing blue poppies.
Right.
And his wife, Valerie, describes them as like slices of the sky, which I think really beautifully captures the awe he feels for the natural world.
Yeah, it's interesting because that awe exists alongside a very real concern about the future.
Yeah.
Truavas is quite pessimistic about humanity's impact on the environment,
Right.
especially what we're doing to plants and forests.
I sense that tension in his words too, this love for something so deeply, but also this fear for its survival.
Yeah.
And he talks about standing among giant sequoia trees and feeling this unbelievable respect for them.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you wonder, if we truly understood plants as intelligent beings, would we treat them differently?
That's the core question this chapter grapples with. What would change if society widely accepted the idea of plant intelligence?
Right.
Would it lead to more sustainable practices?
Yeah.
A deeper respect for the natural world?
For sure.
It forces us to consider our ethical responsibilities?
So how did Truavas even arrive at this idea of plants as intelligent beings?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
It wasn't exactly mainstream thinking when he started out. His journey actually began with a strong ethical stance.
Okay.
As a young researcher, he couldn't bring himself to kill rats for his biochemistry studies,
Oh, wow.
which is something a lot of plant scientists can relate to.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah,
So he turned to plants, seeing them as a more ethical subject for research.
exactly. And then in the 1970s,
Oh, wait.
he encountered general systems theory,
Mm.
which was pretty revolutionary at the time.
Okay.
This theory emphasized that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Right.
That living systems are these interconnected networks.
Yeah.
And Truavas started to apply this thinking to plants,
Hmm.
challenging the prevailing reductionist view that just focused on isolated plant parts.
So instead of seeing plants as just a collection of roots, stems, and leaves,
Yeah,
he started to see them as intelligent networks.
that's right. And this shift in perspective allowed him to see plant behavior in a new light,
Right.
to recognize the complexity and sophistication of their responses to the environment.
So not everyone's on board with this, though, are they?
Well, you're right.
The chapter mentions some scientists kind of pushing back,
Yeah.
arguing that we simply don't know enough yet to make such claims.
Well, and Truavas acknowledges that science is constantly evolving,
Sure.
right? Our
Mm.
understanding of the natural world is always incomplete.
Right.
And he uses the example of parasitic plants.
Mm.
These plants don't photosynthesize.
Wait a second.
They get their nutrients by feeding off other plants.
Plants that don't photosynthesize.
Yeah.
That just blew my mind. I always thought photosynthesis was like the defining characteristic of plants.
It certainly challenges our assumptions, and that's Truavas' point.
Okay.
We're constantly discovering new things about plants,
Right.
things that defy our expectations.
So accepting plant intelligence may not be solely reliant on scientific proof,
Yeah,
but also a willingness to shift our perspective,
I think that's a good point.
to look at the evidence with fresh eyes.
Yeah, the author of the chapter puts it well when they say, science will continue to find that plants are doing more than we imagined, but then the rest of us will have to look at the data and come to our own conclusions.
It's an invitation to be active participants in this process of discovery,
Right.
not just passive recipients of information.
Absolutely. And that engagement can be transformative.
Hmm.
The author themselves describes their thinking as having turned green after years of studying plants.
Okay.
They've begun to see plants not just as objects, but as creatures with their own agency and intelligence.
I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling.
Yeah.
That moment when you start to see the world differently,
Mhm.
to appreciate the complexity and intelligence of life beyond our own species.
It's about expanding our circle of awareness,
Yeah.
recognizing that intelligence takes many forms,
Right.
and that the human perspective is just one way of understanding this vast and intricate web of life.
And speaking of expanding our awareness,
Yeah.
the chapter brings in this really fascinating thought experiment.
Okay.
Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, the author of The Acacia Seeds,
Oh, interesting.
and it imagines a future where we've cracked the code of animal communication,
Okay.
but we haven't even begun to understand plant language.
Interesting.
It's a brilliant way to highlight the limitations of our current understanding.
Right.
We assume that because we haven't deciphered plant communication, it must not be complex or meaningful.
Yeah, but what if we're just not equipped to understand it yet?
It's like we're standing at the edge of a vast unknown,
Yeah.
and our human-centric biases are preventing us from seeing the full picture.
Exactly.
Right.
The chapter connects this fictional scenario to the scientific reality of plant communication through chemicals,
Cool.
a phenomenon that was discovered by David Rhodes.
Yeah.
He found that plants can actually send out chemical signals
Okay.
to warn each other about insect attacks, for example.
So plants can communicate.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I always thought they were just passive beings rooted in the ground, unable to interact with their surroundings in a meaningful way.
That's one of the biggest misconceptions about plants. They're constantly sensing their environment, responding to stimuli, and even communicating with each other.
Wow.
It's just that their methods of communication are different from ours.
Right.
Right.
I'm starting to realize that our definition of intelligence might be too narrow.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on cognitive abilities like problem solving and abstract thought, but maybe intelligence encompasses a much broader range of
I
capacities,
think so.
including the ability to adapt, to communicate, to make choices that benefit the organism.
That's a key insight. The chapter dives into the limitations of the word intelligence itself,
Yeah.
especially its human-centric bias.
Right.
It suggests that we need to expand our understanding of intelligence to encompass the diverse ways in which life expresses itself.
So instead of trying to fit plants into our existing framework of intelligence,
Yeah.
we need to develop a new framework that acknowledges their unique ways of being.
Precisely, the chapter even delves into the etymology of the word intelligence,
Okay.
which comes from the Latin word interlegere, meaning to discern or to choose between.
So at its root, intelligence is about the ability to make choices and respond to the environment.
Yeah,
And plants are clearly capable of doing that.
for sure.
They're constantly making decisions about where to grow their roots, how to allocate their resources, how to defend themselves against predators.
It's about recognizing that plants are active agents in their own right, not just passive objects, and that their choices, their responses to the environment are often remarkably sophisticated.
This makes me think about those convoluted terms some botanists use
Uh-huh.
to avoid saying plants remember or feel.
Right.
It's like they're tying themselves in knots to avoid anthropomorphizing plants.
The chapter addresses this debate head on.
Okay.
It argues that while we need to be careful not to project human qualities onto plants,
Right.
we also shouldn't shy away from using language that acknowledges their capacities.
So how do we strike that balance? How
Yeah.
do we talk about plant intelligence without falling into the trap of anthropomorphism?
The chapter proposes a solution:
Okay.
vegetalizing our language.
Okay.
So instead of saying a plant remembers, we could
Okay.
say it has plant memory.
Okay.
Instead of feeling, we could say plant feeling.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It acknowledges these capacities in plants while respecting their unique nature.
It's a way of bridging the gap between our language and the reality of plant life.
Mm-hmm.
It allows us to talk about these complex concepts without reducing plants to mere imitations of humans.
And this reframing of language is essential because it opens up a whole new way of thinking about plants.
Right.
It allows us to see them as beings with their own forms of intelligence, their own ways of experiencing the world.
It's like we're being invited to step outside of our human-centric worldview
Yeah.
and enter into a different realm of understanding, a realm where plants are not just objects, but subjects, beings with their own agency and intelligence.
And that shifting perspective has profound implications.
Yes.
Not just for our understanding of the natural world,
Right.
but also for our ethical responsibilities towards it.
It does.
If plants are intelligent beings,
Yeah.
do we owe them a certain level of respect and consideration?
That's a huge question,
Yeah,
and one that I am eager to explore further.
for sure.
it seems like this idea of plant intelligence challenges not only our scientific understanding, but also our ethical framework.
Absolutely. It forces us to reconsider our place in the web of life, to acknowledge the interconnectedness of all living things, and to ask ourselves some difficult questions about how we should treat the natural world.
This is definitely getting me thinking.
Yeah.
What if acknowledging plant intelligence isn't just about updating our scientific knowledge, but about undergoing a profound shift in our ethical worldview?
That's a powerful idea, and one that we'll delve into deeper as we continue our deep dive into this fascinating chapter. Stay tuned, because in the next part, we'll explore the concept of plant personhood and the legal implications of recognizing plant rights.
Sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see where this conversation takes us. Last time we were left with this thought-provoking idea that accepting plant intelligence might require a complete shift in our ethical worldview.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a profound question.
One of the things that really struck me was this idea of plant blindness.
Oh, yeah.
Which the chapter touches on. It's this phenomenon where we tend to overlook plants or underestimate their importance. Focusing more on animals.
Yeah, it's a pervasive bias.
Right.
And it has real-world consequences.
For sure.
Plant blindness can lead to apathy about environmental issues, a lack of funding for plant science research, and a general disregard for the vital role that plants play in our lives.
Makes me wonder if this tendency to overlook plants is connected to our inability to recognize their intelligence.
That could be.
If we don't see them as complex, dynamic beings, it's easier to dismiss them as just background scenery.
That's an interesting connection. The chapter argues that recognizing plant intelligence can be an antidote to plant blindness.
Okay.
It can help us see plants with fresh eyes, appreciate their complexity and beauty, and understand their importance in a deeper way.
So it's not just about expanding our scientific knowledge. It's about cultivating a new way of seeing, a new way of relating to the natural world.
Exactly. It's about shifting our perspective from one of human dominance to one of interconnectedness, recognizing that we're part of this vast web of life. That includes plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, all the other organisms that share this planet with us.
And if we can start to see plants as intelligent beings,
Right.
worthy of our respect and consideration, it could have a ripple effect on how we treat the entire natural world.
It's about recognizing the inherent value of all forms of life, not just those that are most similar to us.
Speaking of which, let's talk about this concept of plant personhood.
Okay.
This idea that plants should have legal rights, just like humans and corporations.
It might sound radical, but it's a concept that's gaining traction.
Interesting.
The chapter discusses legal scholar Christopher Stone, who back in 1972 wrote this essay titled, "Should Trees Have Standing?" He argued that recognizing legal rights for nature reflects evolving social values.
Wait, so he was proposing that trees could actually sue in court to protect their interests?
He was arguing that granting legal rights to natural entities like trees and rivers is not as unthinkable as it might seem.
Interesting.
He pointed to the fact that corporations, which are essentially legal fictions, have been granted legal personhood and the ability to sue.
So if a corporation can have legal rights, why not a tree or a forest?
It's a thought-provoking argument.
It is.
And it's not just theoretical. In 2021, there was a case where wild rice sued the state of Minnesota.
Wild rice suing a state?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
For threatening its habitat.
What was the outcome?
Unfortunately, the case was dismissed due to a lack of legal precedent. But it highlights this growing movement to recognize plants' legal rights, even if the legal system hasn't fully caught up yet.
Makes you think about what it would mean to live in a world where plants had legal standing, where their interests were taken into account in legal decisions.
Would it lead to more sustainable practices? Would it force us to reevaluate our relationship with nature?
Those are questions worth pondering, and it's important to note that this idea of plant personhood isn't new. Many indigenous cultures has long viewed plants as persons' relatives or even ancestors, acknowledging their agency and right to exist.
Exactly.
The chapter gives the example of the indigenous Maya belief that humans were created from corn, which ties in nicely with the scientific fact that we share a common evolutionary ancestor with plants.
It's a beautiful connection between cultural beliefs and scientific understanding.
It is.
Highlighting the deep interconnectedness of all life.
And recognizing plant personhood can lead to a sense of respect and responsibility for their well-being.
Right.
The chapter uses the term intersubjective encounters to describe our interactions with plants when we acknowledge them as beings with their own autonomy.
It's about moving beyond a purely utilitarian view of plants. Seeing them not just as resources to be exploited, but as fellow beings worthy of our care and consideration.
This brings me back to something we were discussing earlier about the challenge of talking about plant intelligence without anthropomorphizing.
Right.
The chapter seems to argue that communicating about this topic doesn't have to involve simplifying it.
Exactly. The author believes that you, the listener, are capable of engaging with complex ideas and nuanced discussions.
Right.
In fact, the chapter introduces this concept of brilliant betweenness, a term coined by Yoruba poet and philosopher Bayo Akomolafe.
Brilliant betweenness. I love the sound of that, but I'm not quite sure what it means.
Akomolafe describes it as the interconnectedness of all living things, a state of porousness that mocks the very idea of separation.
Interesting.
It's a reminder that neat categories often fail to capture the complexity of life, especially when it comes to something as multifaceted as intelligence.
So instead of trying to define plant intelligence in human terms, we should embrace the in-betweenness, the ambiguity and complexity that characterize the natural world.
Precisely. And the chapter uses this fascinating story to illustrate this point. The story of a ghost forest.
A ghost forest?
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Discovered deep inside a Puerto Rican cave. The author describes finding this cluster of white seedlings. Growing in bat guano, deep inside a cave where there's no sunlight.
No sunlight?
Yeah.
But how could they possibly survive? Photosynthesis requires light.
Exactly. These seedlings were doomed from the start.
Oh, wow.
They had no chance of survival in that environment.
So why were they even trying to grow? It seems futile.
And yet they were putting all their energy into reaching for the light, growing as tall and slender as possible, even though they knew they would never reach it.
That's heartbreaking, but also incredibly inspiring.
Yeah.
It speaks to this inherent drive to live, to thrive, to overcome obstacles, even in the face of impossible odds.
The chapter draws a parallel to human nature, suggesting that we find meaning not just in success, but in the effort, the trying itself.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that there's value in striving and pushing beyond our limits, even if we don't always achieve our goals.
So it's not just about the outcome.
No.
It's about the process, the journey, the sheer will to exist. And maybe that's part of what it means to be intelligent, to adapt, to strive to keep reaching for the light, even in the darkest of places.
And that brings us back to the importance of plant communities.
Right, because even though we've been focusing on individual plants, it's important to remember that they don't exist in isolation.
Exactly. Plants are part of these complex ecosystems.
Right.
And the health of those ecosystems is crucial.
For sure.
Not only for the well-being of plants, but for all life on Earth, including our own.
We depend on plants for so much oxygen, food, medicine, clean water, fertile soil, climate regulation.
Right.
It's hard to overstate their importance.
And yet we often take them for granted.
Yeah, we do.
We clear forests, pollute waterways, disrupt ecosystems without fully considering the consequences.
It's like we've forgotten that we're part of this intricate web of life.
Yeah.
That our fate is intertwined with the fate of plants.
The chapter reminds us that recognizing plant intelligence isn't just an intellectual exercise.
Right.
It's a call to action, an invitation to reevaluate our relationship with nature and to make choices that support the well-being of all life.
So where do we go from here? What does it look like to put these ideas into practice?
That's a great question, and one that we'll explore further as we continue our deep dive into this fascinating chapter.
I'm ready for more. This conversation is really opening my eyes to a whole new way of seeing the world. It's really been quite a journey exploring this whole idea of plant intelligence.
It has.
We've looked at the science, the philosophy, even touched on the legal implications.
Yeah, makes you rethink our place in the world, doesn't it?
It does.
Like we're so used to seeing ourselves at the top of some hierarchy.
Right.
But maybe intelligence takes many forms, flourishes in ways we're only beginning to grasp.
And one of the things that keeps coming up for me is this idea of brilliant betweenness.
Oh, yeah.
That interconnectedness the chapter emphasizes. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what that truly means for us.
Yeah, it's challenging for sure. It asks us to move beyond rigid categories, simple definition. Think back to that image of the ghost forest.
Right.
Those seedlings desperately reaching for light they'd never reach.
Yeah, it was such a poignant example of how life persists even in those seemingly impossible circumstances.
Exactly. And that persistence, that drive to adapt and thrive, it's present not just in individual plants, but woven through entire plant communities. The chapter shifts our focus to this larger scale in its final section.
Which makes sense. We can't truly understand plant intelligence without understanding the communities they form.
Right.
The ecosystems they create and sustain.
And those ecosystems are what make life on Earth possible for all of us, not just plants.
Right.
They provide us with clean air, fresh water, fertile soil, the foundation of everything.
And it's easy to forget that connection in our day-to-day lives.
Absolutely. We take so much for granted.
We do.
But the chapter reminds us that plant communities act as these giant carbon sinks, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and mitigating climate change.
So plants are literally helping to keep our planet habitable.
It's a massive ongoing process, forests, grasslands, even tiny phytoplankton in the ocean. They're all playing a role in regulating the global carbon cycle.
So without them, the effects of climate change would be even more severe.
For sure.
Wow. And that's just one example. They also regulate water cycles.
Right.
Prevent soil erosion. Provide habitat for countless species. It's a whole interconnected web.
It really highlights the fact that our well-being is deeply intertwined with the well-being of plant life.
It does.
It's not a separate issue.
Right.
It's central to our own survival.
Hearing all this makes that idea of brilliant betweenness feel a lot more real, a lot more urgent.
Yeah.
It's not just a poetic concept. It's the reality of how life works on this planet.
And it has ethical implications, too.
Yeah, it does.
When we recognize this interconnectedness, can we continue to treat plants as mere resources, there for our taking?
That's the question the chapter leaves us with, isn't it? What does it actually mean to acknowledge plant intelligence?
It's not just about understanding the science, though, that's crucial. It's about shifting our perspective, moving away from that human-centric worldview.
Recognizing that we're part of something much larger, much more complex than we often realize.
And that recognition can be a powerful motivator for change.
It can.
It can lead to more sustainable practices, a greater respect for the natural world, a sense of responsibility for the well-being of all life.
I think this whole deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking.
I agree.
It's definitely changed how I see the world around me, made me more aware of the plants I encounter every day.
I hope that's true for our listeners as well.
I do too.
This is just a starting point, an invitation to keep exploring this fascinating field.
Yeah, to keep questioning, keep learning.
Yeah.
And maybe even start to see a little brilliance in those everyday encounters with the plant world.
I like that.
Well, thanks for joining us.